My name is Wendy Schiller. I'm the professor of political science and the chair of the political science department. And along with Professor Susan Moffett, who's the director, who's an associate professor of political science and public and international affairs, as well as the director of the Taubman Center. And on behalf of the director of of Watson, Ed Steinfeld, Professor Steinfeld, we'd like to welcome you to this panel on race, gender, and the Democratic Party in 2020. It could go on for hours, but I think what we're going to try to do today is ask the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes. So each of us will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll take question Q&A for anywhere from however many questions and answers there are, but probably 20 to 30 minutes is our max. And we will cover, if you want to ask general questions about politics, there's been a lot going on in the last 2.5 days. You're welcome to do that, and where we can answer that with credibility, we will try. So I wanted to introduce our panelists. Professor Katherine Tate. Professor Tate is professor of political science at Brown University and the author, co-author, or co-editor of 6 books, including most recently Concordance, Black Lawmaking in the U.S. Congress from Carter to Obama, which will be issued in paperback with a new introduction this August. Professor Tate teaches courses on American politics generally, public opinion, race, and gender. So welcome, Professor Tate. Professor Andrew, known to us as Drew Engelhardt, is a postdoctoral research associate in the Taubman Center. He's a political psychologist by training. His research focuses on the relationship between politics and individual social identities and attitudes about social groups. He's published work on these topics, has appeared in a variety of disciplinary journals. He is currently teaching a course on survey design. Professor Jonathan Collins, all the way down to my right. Jonathan Collins is an assistant professor of education at Brown University. His research interests, and also a faculty affiliate of the Annenberg Center and the political science department. His research interests center on questions of racial and ethnic minority political behavior, democratic governance, local and urban politics, and public policy, particularly education policy. Professor Collins teaches courses on urban education policy, inequality, and race. Welcome, Professor Collins. And again, I've already introduced myself. My specialty is the U.S. Congress, and now I'm pivoting to studying questions of federalism, gender, and human security. So I think we'll just start, and we'll start with Professor Tate.
Despite the social diversity of contenders, polls show that blacks intend to vote for former Vice President Joe Biden, a white candidate, in the Democratic primary contest. A Washington Post Ipsos poll taken January 8, 2020 shows that Biden has 48% of the registered black Democratic vote, and Senator Bernie Sanders has about 20% of the vote. The news that blacks picked Biden and Sanders, 2 white men, as their choice for president over highly credible minority, gay, and female candidates has been relatively constant throughout the media coverage of this race. So why don't blacks want another Obama or someone who could make history again? Analysts and pundits claim that the black vote favors Biden because of pragmatism and fear. Biden is a mainstream liberal and not a progressive like Sanders or Senator Elizabeth Warren, who campaign on the promise of systemic social change. In previous work, a book that I published called What's Going On, Political Incorporation, the Transformation of Black Public Opinion, I show how, since the 1970s, blacks have moved from the far left closer to the left center. And while blacks tend to give more highly favorable responses to policy slogans such as Medicare for all and socialized medicine than whites, nearly matching percentages of blacks and whites felt that the Democrats in Congress should focus their efforts on improving the 2010 Affordable Health Care Act rather than work on Medicare for all. This is based on an April 2019 Kaiser Family Foundation poll. So you've got a small majority, 54% of blacks, who felt that improving the 2010 Health Care Act was critical, versus only 40% of blacks who felt that Democrats in Congress should move to passing Medicare for all. So black political radicalism tends to be overstated, and a majority act had favored conservative welfare reform in the 1990s based on a 1996 survey. So despite claims that Biden hasn't done anything to deserve black support, His moderate policy stances are important to blacks who consider themselves moderate Democrats as well. That blacks are more pragmatic about policy change in the United States is one reason why blacks find Biden acceptable, but another reason is fear. In an April 2017 CBS News poll, when asked whether excited, optimistic, concerned, or scared, 45% of blacks reported feeling scared about what Donald Trump is doing as president compared to only 22% of whites. Another 44% of blacks said that they were concerned, and only 11% of blacks felt excited or optimistic about the Trump presidency in 2017. Majority felt blacks felt that under the Trump administration, people like themselves were going to be treated less fairly. No black responded in that CBS News poll in 2017 felt that people like themselves would be treated more fairly under Trump. The rest, 44%, felt that there'd be no change in how they were treated. Finally, pluralities to majorities of consider Trump to have worsened race relations. So you've got 42% of whites who say that Trump has worsened race relations, and about 64% of blacks say that the Trump policies have encouraged racial divisions. So if the polls prove correct, blacks are going to back Biden for the Democratic presidential nomination, and their snub of these minority candidates, I think, needs interpretation. The analysis here suggests that it wasn't disillusionment with descriptive representation in the aftermath of the Obama years that explains black voting behavior. Blacks proved to be highly popular with, Obama proved to be highly popular with blacks as president. Many credit his election with positive change in race relations. But in seeking not in choosing not to seek another historic change maker, will this vote for Biden be a strategic error? In backing Biden, some wonder whether blacks will turn out in sufficient large numbers to secure a Democratic victory in 2020. But with Donald Trump's unconventional style and open bigotry, there's been no president like the Trump presidency as far as blacks are concerned. And so the Trump presidency may be enough to generate a vigorous black turnout. I wanted to talk about the women's vote now. The women's vote has never decisively backed one of their own like blacks. This said, women Democrats favored Clinton over Sanders in the 2016 Democratic primary race, but this could have been as much as with the issues as it was with the novelty of backing a woman for president. When Hillary Clinton became the first female on the general presidential ticket in 2016, there was a significant gender gap, with women more likely to vote for her than men. Women were about 12% more likely to have voted for Clinton, while men were 12% more likely to have voted for Trump in 2016 based on exit polls. This was the largest gender gap ever recorded. And but then Clinton famously won not the white women's vote, who exit polls revealed had backed Republican Donald Trump, or at least the polls suggest that they were divided equally between Trump and Clinton in 2016 concerning white women. The polls show that women are actually more pessimistic about the chances of a woman winning the White House than men. In 2008 CNN Opinion Research Corporation poll, when asked if the United States was ready for a woman president, 72% of men said yes, and 63% of women said yes. But in other surveys, roughly matching percentages of men and women think that the U.S. will have a U.S. Female president in their lifetime. In August 2016 Pew Research poll, 62% said the election of a woman would be very important or somewhat important. Only 36% said that it would not be important or important at all. I want to speed through some of the statistics because I only have 10 minutes. I wanted to just point out that although studies find that women have the same odds as winning their election as men, voters believe that women face a tougher time as candidates for elective office. So in September 2019, Fox News polls said of likely primary voters that 49% of the respondents said that Democrats will have a tough time defeating Donald Trump if they nominate a woman. 47% disagreed with that. In an April 2019 poll, of self-identified registered Democrats, when asked if it's better for the Democrats to nominate a woman or nominate a man to run against Trump for president in 2020, 77% said it doesn't matter, actually. But 7% said it'd be better if the Democrats nominate a woman, and 12% said a man. Other surveys show that the public is divided in whether being female helps or hurts candidates. But when the 2020 election is framed as a must-win against Donald Trump, negativity about gender does translate into less support for the women running for the Democratic Party's nomination. Like blacks, women may want to pick a non-controversial, non-history-making candidate like Joe Biden. Is the election for women more about Trump than making history, as it is for blacks? So they, are not organized around seeing Democrats nominate another woman like Senator Elizabeth Warren or Amy Klobuchar. Survey data show that women are more concerned about Donald Trump than men. In a 2017 CBS News poll, when asked if excited, optimistic, concerned, or scared, 33% of women said that the Trump administration scared them, compared to 21% of men. Matching percentages of women and men said that they were excited, and more men than women said they were optimistic about the Trump presidency. About 41% of women said that they would be treated less fairly under the Trump administration, compared to 28% of men. Men were more likely to say that there'd be no change in how people were treated in the Trump administration. Trump is seen as particularly hostile to women, and polls suggest that the narrow lead that Trump has among white women may have fallen in 2020, or by 2020. So with enormous disfavor by women voters and a high turnout among Democratic voters, Trump might very well be defeated in his bid for re-election as president. Lastly, I wanted to talk about attitudes toward the prospects of a gay president. Surveys show serious hostility toward gay candidates running for president. In a poll conducted in April 2019, when asked if they're open to electing a president who's a gay man, 23% said no. In the same poll, 52% said the U.S. is not ready to elect a president who's gay. 12%, which is high, said that they didn't know if the U.S. was ready or not. So we've got the 52% with 12%. A large segment of the public thinks that the public is not ready to elect a gay president, which again is going to be a drag on Pete Buttigieg's candidacy. June 2019 poll conducted by CBS News found that 69% said Americans are not ready to elect a gay or lesbian president. Half of the sample said that the Democrats will have a tougher time defeating Donald Trump in 2020 if they nominate a gay candidate. 44% disagreed with that statement. That 50% is basically identical to the same poll showing that if the Democrats nominate a woman, they'll have a tough time defeating Donald Trump for re-election in 2020. The data aren't yet available for me to analyze this further in terms of opinions of women and blacks to see, more in depth what they think about Pete Buttigieg's candidacy and prospects for making history by electing a openly gay president. In general, I would say that what's going to happen is, despite Buttigieg's good showing in Iowa, blacks are going to stick by Biden unless Biden drops out the race somehow. And so, a big scandal concerning Biden could help, obviously, Pete Buttigieg in his candidacy for the White House. Blacks I don't think, are going to be I think they would support Buttigieg if Biden dropped out. He would have a good chance at winning their votes. But I was, making sort of a joke about the scandal in terms of Ukraine. Where is Ukraine for Pete Buttigieg? he needs to contact them. Um, Anyway, with that, I think I'll stop. So,
Thank you very much. Okay, so I think I might go to Professor Collins now because I think you're offering sort of a different perspective, but dimensional topics, right? Okay, great. And then we'll go to Professor
Thank you, Catherine, for giving that analysis of what was going on with African American voters, especially in polling um, heading into primary season, and also for giving a good breakdown of gender differences and sexism. I just kind of wanted to build on it. So essentially, um, I wanted to talk about a few things. Black voters, based off of a Washington Post survey that was conducted in January of 2020. I wanted to talk about some findings from a paper that I wrote about Bernie Sanders in the 2016 election, and also a few things about latent sexism, and then pretty much a couple of takeaways of things to remember as we're watching the primary unfold and heading into the general election. So the thing about African American voters when it comes to the Democratic primary, we actually have seen, and folks can probably have witnessed this. Joe Biden is losing steam. In the 2020 survey, only like compared to earlier surveys, only 48% of African Americans said that their first choice for a Democratic primary would be Joe Biden. 20% said Bernie Sanders, and then they were also asked to give their second choice. And as second choice voters, amongst second choice options, Bernie Sanders rises to the top. 24% of African Americans listed Bernie Sanders as their second choice if they weren't if they went with sort of Joe Biden during their first choice. There are only a set of candidates. The only set of candidates that they're not considering: Tulsi Gabbard at 23%. 17% of African Americans said that they would not consider Michael Bloomberg. And speaking to what Catherine is finding when it comes to issues with electing a gay president, about 15% of African Americans said that they would not, under any circumstances, support Pete Buttigieg. The net favorability ratings, just how people feel about, how African American voters feel about the candidates, largely relate to some of the things that they're saying in terms of electability. Biden is still the net favorite, but the lead is slimming. 69% of African Americans had some sort of had a either extremely or somewhat favorable view of Joe Biden. Bernie Sanders was right behind at 63%. Elizabeth Warren not too much farther behind at 51%. And one of the things that I find kind of funny, kind of interesting, is that Cory Booker was at 42%, while Buttigieg and Bloomberg were both in the 20s. Also the interesting thing about Buttigieg is that it's hard to determine how much his sexual orientation is factoring into his lack of political support amongst African Americans, because he also had the second lowest level of name recognition amongst African American voters as well. So it'll be interesting to see how evaluations of Pete Buttigieg change as his media coverage increases and his notoriety increases as well. Electability is one of the biggest things for African American voters. They were more likely to say that 57% said that they would support whatever candidate is more likely to beat Trump. Only 33% said they would vote for the candidate that was closest to them in their policy positions. And when stacking candidates up against Trump, 82% would vote for Biden over Trump, 74% vote for Sanders over Trump, and 71% would vote for Warren over Trump. With Buttigieg, it gets closer to 50-50. I'm doing it, so I should probably skip to some stuff.
No, yeah, that's it.
Oh, it's okay. There are a few findings in the survey that make for some complicated narratives to form. So, for instance, there was more reservation about electing someone over the age of 70. 45% of African Americans said they had some sort of reservation about electing someone over the age of 70, while 41% said they had reservations about electing a gay man. So more reservations about electing someone over 70 than electing a gay man, significantly more concerned about electing a billionaire than electing a gay man. 41% electing a gay man, 53% have reservations about electing a billionaire, even though Michael Bloomberg seems to be doing better in terms of net favorability amongst African Americans than Pete Buttigieg. So how do you reconcile these things? Right. 46% believe 46% of African Americans believe that Trump deserves at least some sort of credit for low African American employment. Right. So the sort of standard political science model, right? Economic factors are the leading predictor of vote share. Well, African Americans are to an extent recognizing changes in the economy, and almost half are attributing that to some extent to Donald Trump. Now, one of the interesting things that always pops up, especially in general elections, but I think is popping up more in the primary election given 2016, is the role of young voters, and especially the millennial generation and the Gen Zers. What I find in a paper from doing an analysis of 2016 using the collaborative multiracial post-election survey conducted through a collaborative of researchers, of political scientists across the country. What I wanted to know was what was the strongest predictor of third-party voting, or people who voted for neither the Democrat or the Republican. And when you disaggregate the data and separate it by age cohort, the interesting finding that, that we emerged with was that, well, consistently across cohorts, you found the two strongest predictors to be unfavorable opinions of Donald Trump and unfavorable opinions of Hillary Clinton, and favorable opinions toward one of the third party candidates. But for millennials, it was also high levels of favorability towards Bernie Sanders. So millennials who were voting third party during the general election were statistically more likely to have a relatively strong sort of affinity for Bernie Sanders. We interpret these findings as suggested it was what we call a sort of a failed handoff of support from the losing primary candidate to the winning primary candidate. And we also suspect that this is one of the reasons why Bernie Sanders has been able to amass so much steam going into the 2020 election, a carryover of young voters, especially young millennial voters and millennial voters of color, who had more support aimed towards Bernie Sanders than probably realized during 2016. You combine why was Bernie Sanders so captivating in 2016? Our analysis suggests that it was because he attracted voters who had low levels of vote efficacy, who didn't really think that their vote was effective or mattered, folks who had very high levels of government distrust, folks who had deep concerns about inequality, and this might probably not be much of a surprise, student loan debt. Right? So, how much time I have?
About 2 minutes.
2 minutes? Okay, cool. Got a couple things I want to say about Latinx voters. Latinx voters, according to a poll conducted about a month ago by Latino Decisions, are still a very malleable voting group. Near a third said that they would consider voting for Trump. This is malleability relative to African Americans. Only about around 20% of African Americans would even think about considering Donald Trump. About a little bit over a third for Latinx voters. The biggest predictors, or the biggest things that were associated with a lack of support for Trump or support for the Democratic candidates was immigration policies, opposition for building the wall, support for DACA. Latent sexism is also playing a big role in the primary. Katherine mentions this. There's a political scientist at Tufts University, Brian Schaffner, who's been doing some analysis based off of the CCES, and he finds latent sexism to be strong predictors of support for both Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And yeah, I think the biggest takeaways to think about when you're thinking about presidential primaries, primary voters are not the same as general election voters. Primary voters tend to be have higher levels of political interest. They follow politics more closely. They read the news more. So things can be different transitioning from the primaries to the generals for sure. Electability is still very, very important, and it's one of the things that makes support during presidential primaries very, very malleable. Um, as I showed with African Americans, one of the biggest, the most important factors in picking a candidate seem to be electability. Electability is a function of, typically a function of the ability of candidates to both attract and withstand, attract media coverage and withstand uh, attacks when media coverage emerges. And this factors into their ability to be electable. But these perceptions of electability play a big role in their ability to sustain themselves during a presidential primary. And what we argue in the third party voting paper is that, especially given the polarized nature of partisan politics right now, um, candidate coordination post primary is very important. So as Democrats are siloing with Democrats, Republicans are siloing with Republicans, it's really up to the Democratic leadership to show some sort of cohesiveness. Or what you could also see is these divisions within parties also deepening as the divide across parties is deepening as well.
Thank you very much. Okay, Professor Engelhardt.
So first, I wanted to start off by thanking the Watson Institute, the Taubman Center, and the Political Science Department for organizing this afternoon's event, and to all of you for coming out. So in my 10 minutes, I want to focus on three things that I think help us kind of understand, in part, why the Democratic primary has shaken out the way it has so far, given diversity within the party, why we have a relatively non-diverse top of the ticket right now in terms of potential candidates. And these three things that I want to focus on are social identity repertoires, political party commitments, and white racial identity and racial attitudes. So first, social identity repertoires. By this, I mean the sets of identities, the different social group memberships that people have. These can be national identities, regional identities, class, religion, and for today's panel, race and gender. They also include party, which I'll get more to in my second point in a moment. What's helpful in thinking about these varied attachments is that it helps us understand differences in why people support the candidates that they do. Some people care deeply, for instance, about their religious identity. So when they're looking at the set of candidates before them, they'll have their religious identity kind of like spectacles or hat on when they're trying to decide between the candidates. Other people care deeply about their gender, racial, or class identities. This variation is important when we think about the candidates that are available and how some of these identities might overlap to encourage individuals to support one candidate over another. Or in some instances, these identities might cross-cut or run against each other, pushing somebody to maybe think about considering two or more candidates. So it's important to know that not everybody who shares the same identity is going to support the same candidate. It's conditional in part on how much they care about the identity and what other identities they have that they also care about. Further, people have different understandings about what they believe to be the implications of caring about a certain identity. If I care about being young, white, or male, that does not necessarily mean that I'm going to support a candidate who's young, white, or male. It might, but it could also mean that I'm going to support candidates who are going to advocate policies that support the groups that I care about, not somebody who is descriptively representative, somebody who looks like me. I might care more about substantive representation. It doesn't matter if they look like me, so long as they are pursuing policies that I care about. So to understand dynamics related to race and gender or other sorts of identity-based groups, it's important to think about going beyond poll breakdowns of candidate support by demographic groups. Just because someone exists in a certain category gives us little insight into which candidate they're going to support, and if that candidate who they're supporting happens to drop out, which direction their support will then turn. So for my second point, I want to focus on party commitments. So in these sets of identities that individuals have include their partisanship, whether people identify as Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and so on. So for most people participating in the Democratic primary, they're probably going to think of themselves as Democrats. But they're also going to vary in the degree to which they care about being Democrats, the degree to which they kind of bind their own self-concept in with the successes and failures of the Democratic primary, the Democratic Party and its candidates and politicians. So this party commitment, I think, has two implications, which help us understand why the Democratic primary has shaped up as it has. The first fits with ideas of pragmatism, which we've heard from Professor Tate and Professor Collins. One of the main considerations many Democratic primary voters have right now is how the subsequent Democratic candidate will do against President Trump in November. So if you look at polls, many Democrats say that beating Trump is important to them in deciding who to support. In our fall Taubman poll, for instance, when asked to name what the most important problem facing the country is today, 45% of Democrats say that it's President Trump. And second, healthcare at 15%. So there's this big gap between issues that candidates are emphasizing within the Democratic primary and Democratic identifiers' emphasis on it doesn't really matter about the issues, we just care about winning in November. So the second thing that party commitments can do is shape how people see the relationship between the groups that they're in, their gender, racial, religious, etc., and the way that politics will carry out within the parties. So people may see the party as a good vehicle for achieving the policies that they want, even if the policies are group specific. So if I'm invested in the Democratic Party and care a lot about being a Democrat, I may trade off, for instance, supporting a younger candidate who might better understand issues facing people like me, and instead back a candidate who is more part of the party establishment and who therefore has a probably better chance of getting things passed that I care about if elected in office. So in this way, party commitments can intercede between other group attachments to shape which candidate people support. So depending on how many people feel this way, how many people are actually basing their candidate choice on which candidate is a member of the party establishment, we might see a viable candidate pool that, that is not terribly representative of the party descriptively, even if, given the policies that they're pursuing, they're going to be more substantively representative of the Democratic Party base than in prior years. So the third point I want to make is going to focus on an important development among white Democrats in the last few years. So in the last several years, white Democrats are changing their attitudes about racial and ethnic minorities in important ways. So they're now holding more positive attitudes about Black, Latino, and Asian Americans than in basically any period we can find for available survey data. And these surveys also suggest that white Democrats are also more supportive of policies like affirmative action and immigration reform. These shifts matter because it affects how Democratic politicians can campaign. Candidates may have felt constrained in endorsing these policies and appealing to groups like Black and Latino Americans because they feared a backlash among white voters within the Democratic primary or also within the general electorate. But now candidates can openly campaign on more progressive policies. Candidates like Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden can now talk about criminal justice reform or path to citizenship. Where in prior years they may have wanted to advocate these positions, but given what their beliefs about the Democratic electorate looked like, they may have not voiced these positions. Whether these candidates' messages are seen as credible, especially by communities of color, is another story. But shifts in whites' attitudes can allow for better substantive representation, even if the candidates that are still campaigning for the Democratic Party's nominee don't look a lot like the rest of the party. Importantly, this shift in attitudes runs against a countercurrent within the Democratic Party, which is that not all white Democrats hold these more positive beliefs. And further, many white Democrats actually care about being white. This is not to say that caring about being white is synonymous with being prejudiced. These are two separate concepts. One of them focuses on just caring about your racial in-group, while the other one, prejudice, focuses on thinking poorly of racial out-groups. But these both can have similar consequences in terms of supporting, say, a white candidate if for the Democratic Party's nomination. So you have a tension there between a growing proportion of the Democratic Party that's open to these more progressive policies on issues that racial and ethnic minorities care about, but it runs up against a non-trivial part of the party that is more opposed to these policies. So to summarize, I think it's important to think about the various identities that people have and how they can pull people between different candidates. Just because someone sits in a given demographic category does not mean that they won't be motivated to support a candidate that is in that same category. Likewise, people vary in the extent to which they care about what happens to the party. If they care more about being Democrats, then this may translate into supporting a candidate they see as more likely to get elected in November. They may also see the party as a perfectly fine vehicle for securing policies they care about, and will thus not prioritize supporting a candidate that looks like them, potentially ending up with somebody who's old, white, and male. Finally, white Democrats are more open now than in past years to progressive policies on racialized issues like criminal justice reform, affirmative action, and immigration. And this can allow candidates to take similar positions and garner support across a diverse set of groups. But at the same time, a non-trivial part of the Democratic Party is lukewarm and even hostile to these policies. And similarly for Republicans, the party may hope to persuade in the fall. So while these attitude shifts can open the door for the party to better substantively represent people of color, despite a white candidate potentially at the top of the ticket, there are tensions that will likely make this representation difficult in terms of trying to garner support among a different electorate in the general election than the one that these candidates face in the primary.
You want to respond to anything that's been said so far?
I think that's it's going to be important in this election. Just to reiterate that, again, trying to make sense of the 2020 election early, as opposed to say 10 years later, it's, I think striking that we have such a fine list of candidates, but that we're settling down to this sort of white male, or maybe if Warren pulls it out, white female list, which I think will require some sort of an explanation. And so I'm explaining it that it's President Trump, and that had another president been in office, these minority candidates, I think, would have done far better. But this question of electability and picking a non-controversial choice, a safe choice, is, I think, at the forefront of a lot of the voters today.
I think I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Thank you very much for that elaboration. I'm switching gears a little bit just to point out the difference in what you might call, I don't know if I call it the health of the Democratic Party, but certainly the role and power exhibited by women and members of Congress in particular, but also state legislators and governors. There's a lot of governors. There was a female governor who gave the response by the Democratic Party last night to an underrepresented group. So, for example, the top of the ticket in this realm, Elizabeth Warren has been tumbling quickly, and I'm going to talk a little bit at the end. I'm going to time myself, actually. I'll talk a little bit at the end about the Hillary, Bernie, Elizabeth Warren dynamic, which is just interesting, if not only because it's invisible. It doesn't seem to be visible right now in terms of women. But women are doing phenomenally well in the Democratic Party, at least on the national level, in the congressional level, right? The House of Representatives had a historic year at the Democratic Party in 2018. And there's a report that comes out from the Congressional Research Service that just gives you a membership profile for the 116th Congress. And there are 131 women in the 116th Congress. This Congress, by comparison, 35 years ago, there were 23 women. 23. So that's, you may say 30 years, it took too long, but there are 105 women in the House, and there are 26 female senators. In 1986, for example, according to this, there are 2 female senators, and most, if not all, not in the Senate, but in the House, of these women are Democrats. I think we all are probably aware there's a Democratic woman who's the Speaker of the House. Now, this is the second time she's been elected Speaker of the House. And there are, as I said, a lot of female governors. Gina Raimondo is one of them that have become quite prominent in the National Democratic Party organization. But Gretchen Whitmer, governor of Michigan, elected in 2018, among others. And Lujan in New Mexico, among others. And the governor of Oregon. I mean, the list goes on. There's a fair amount of institutional power being wielded by women who are Democrats. So there's this odd tension. That's probably not even the right word for it, but there's an odd puzzle. How is it that women have not emerged in 2020, and I give credence to the Trump explanation and the Hillary hangover. But around the country, every single 2 years, mostly, more women are being elected, and more women are being elected to higher positions in office, getting to 26 senators. You could have, just looking at the vulnerable seats going into 2020, you're probably looking at a net gain of at least one, possibly two female senators. So when you think about that, you think, what's going on in the Democratic Party? How is it that there's acceptance of women at the local level and a historic number of women of color now sit in the House of Representatives? And sometimes you wonder about saying that term because that just means it was really too low for a really long time. So now we're happy that it's just even getting to bare parity and not quite. But you think about that, and you think about the vast differences across the newcomers in 2018: race, geography, ethnicity, religion, married, single, straight, gay. It's a fairly diverse set of women, and they're loud and they're proud. They're not women who shy away from asserting themselves, but they assert themselves in a way that people who studied the Congress 40 years ago would recognize. They assert themselves as representatives of their districts. There are some women who've emerged on the national stage, maybe not as much, but for the most part, when they speak, they're finely attuned to their district. And that includes men and women in their district and people of their same background, or white voters. Lauren Underhill defeated a white Republican man in Illinois, and she's got a district that is not particularly easy to win for African Americans. So I think it's really important to recognize that this is a puzzle for us. So when you think of the unified lens through which voters are examining and thinking about how they're going to vote in 2020, it's actually not unified when it comes to women. It seems that at these levels, voters are much more, particularly in the Democratic Party, but even across the board, much more accepting of women. Marsha Blackburn, Republican, was elected in Tennessee, a very vocal, prominent member of the House as a Republican woman, but defeated a fairly popular former governor from Tennessee. And big. She won big. It wasn't even close. So there's that juxtaposition about gender. That's just that it's imposing gender at every level of government and then using it as an explanation for choice and opinion, I think doesn't work. It just doesn't work in American politics today. And that's something really to think deeply about. It strikes us, or me, as less pronounced for Latino and African Americans than for women purely. But there's also this question of Latinos. So the Latino, there's several major caucuses in the House of Representatives and Congress itself, and there are 50 Latino members of the Congress, and 45 are in the House. That's a lot more than used to be. But they're much more balanced in terms of partisanship. There's more Republican Latinos than there are Republican members of Congress who are African American, for example. So when you think about that and you think about the Democratic Party, you realize why, voting to convict Trump or oust Trump, African Americans are in the high 60s on that, and Latinos are at 50%. And if you go across the board, how's Nancy Pelosi doing? How's the Democratic Party doing? Latinos are far more split. In fact, Jonathan cited some interesting stats. Generally, Republicans get about 27% of the Latino vote in presidential elections, going all the way up to George W. Bush, who some people claim got as high as 44%. But you can look at public approval and see that there's vast differentiation among Latino voters. And so why Julian Castro didn't do as well in the Democratic Party is not surprising to me at all. I don't think it's a natural home for the Democratic Party, and I'll get to that in 1 second, namely because of issues of abortion, particularly the predominance of evangelical or Catholic religious affiliation among Latinos. As the Democratic Party gets more liberal, certainly on same-sex marriage, a section of the Latino community is not as comfortable with the Democratic Party as they might be. And so you can argue that there's a lot of variation in social views amongst the African American voters, but there's a much stronger history, I think, of policy congruence in the African American voters, although as Catherine's most recent book shows us, African American activists and members of Congress were far more active, far more progressive, and far more liberal 40 years ago than they are today. So there's real puzzles here, and I think you can't just look at it through the lens of this primary contest. But let me talk a little bit about I want to talk about Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and I want to talk about just to push some buttons here. Why not? I think the surprising element so far of our conversation about the Democratic Party is the lack of discussion about the potential failure of Elizabeth Warren to win the nomination, and particularly why Elizabeth Warren has failed to win a lot of support among African American or African American women and Latino women, and then why there's no discussion of potential backlash against Bernie Sanders by women who supported Hillary Clinton in 2016 within the party. How angry are the core female Clinton supporters? Will they actually stay home and not vote against Donald Trump by casting an affirmative vote for Bernie Sanders because they're still angry in their mind that he denied women their first female president? And there's no discussion of this whatsoever. And we can see some of this latent sexism. Hillary Clinton fell down on a very hot day. She had the flu. It was as if she was hiding some major disease. Bernie Sanders had a heart attack and had 2 stents put in and didn't tell anybody about it for 2 weeks. And blip. It was a blip in time. He's perfectly fine. I mean, these are not ancient examples of these sorts of things. And the question is the distinct movement of women from Donald Trump, and to some extent in 2018, to the Democratic Party to vote for women, is that going to stay if Bernie Sanders is the nominee? There's a lot of discussion about levels of African American turnout not being high enough if Bernie Sanders is the nominee. But are some women going to say, that's it, I'm just going to write in Michael Bloomberg, I'm going to write in Hillary Clinton, I'm not casting my vote for this man? That is something nobody is talking about. And I don't know why, because you talk to some women and you think this is a real possibility. However, as Katherine talked about and the rest of the panelists, Jonathan and Drew, women do not like Donald Trump as a rule. The gender gap has grown under Donald Trump, and we see women voting with their feet, literally voting with their feet against Donald Trump, and for women and for men who promise to oppose Donald Trump. So the issue of abortion, knowing that there are some potential retirements on the Supreme Court in the next 4 to 5 years, knowing that the court will turn so conservative they'll probably roll abortion back to the states, seeing all the fetal heartbeat bills. You do polling, and women are, Americans are 60 to 65% against outlawing abortion, but women go even higher. So when you think about that issue alone, you wonder if allegiance to a female candidate like Hillary Clinton or Elizabeth Warren will actually override the concern about reproductive choice, contraception, and abortion. And I'm old enough to remember when abortion was a major issue in the 1980s. And when you think about it, it's now returned as a major issue. And the one thing I'll say there, and then I'll stop, is that one of the things I think the older generation, and I'd say that anybody over maybe 35, 40, let's see, as they get older, that number goes up. If you do the statistics on abortion and you look at how many women do medically induced with pill abortion versus procedural clinical abortion, and the restrictions really in this country now are on clinical procedural abortions, 2/3 of all abortions are now through the pill, through the medically induced. And the next generation of women, if they've got contraception available to them and they believe they can order this pill through Amazon or from Canada, I don't know what that mobilization effect is on young millennial women. Whereas in the 70s and 80s, maybe even early 90s, women of that era were really out in force on this issue. It's unclear now whether this issue really is approximate enough to their lives in terms of inconvenience or unavailability that it will still be an issue in the Democratic Party. And I think these issues are important, and they're not being discussed, and you hear nothing about it except Trump. But when it comes down to voting, in the end of the day, I think these issues will come back, and they will certainly come back in the races for the Senate. So I think I'm out of time, so I'd like to open it up to any response from the panelists and then to the audience for questions.
I'll say a quick thing about that last point. Why I can see it going in a different direction, because abortion and other social policy issues, there's the experiential aspect of it, but there's also the symbolic aspect. So, like for instance, union membership and union allegiance. So, over 1/3 of Americans hold favorable views towards unions, yet I think less than 10% of the American workforce is actually unionized. So even despite the fact that people aren't joining unions, people still think favorably about unions, and people still form policy opinions that are very much anti-free markets and pro government expansion, driven by the fact that they still have strong affinity towards unions, and is driven by just kind of a symbolic attachment. Even if you don't have an experience with being a part of a union, you still think about a union as something that represents people's rights and workers' rights, and standing up for certain aspects of like a public life. So, and I think abortion could do a similar thing. Whereas that even as young women aren't experiencing abortion in the same way as women did of older generations, the fact that it has this symbolic value of encroaching on women's rights, I think it could still maintain its stability as a political issue that mobilizes women in particular on the left.
Yes, I'll open it up. I have a question, but I'll fill the time if we have time.
About the nominating process, I mean, we hear a lot of talk about the Electoral College and how flawed it is, and my personal opinion is that the primary process is much worse and much more broken, and it has a lot of differential, I think, access for people of different persuasions, colors, and so on. Obviously, Iowa and New Hampshire being prime examples, but welcome the views of the panelists about that topic.
So you want to talk about it?
So are you interested in like alternative methods to structuring the primary, or like the consequences of like Iowa and New Hampshire going first and second? Mhm.
All three of those things are quite poorly understood, I think, and have massive influences on the nominating process and who we wind up as president.
Yeah, so a couple of colleagues and I were actually interested in this in 2016, and we were interested in kind of like testing, for instance, do kind of like election outcomes within the primary. So like, does doing well in Iowa give you a boost in support in subsequent like contest outcomes? Trying to get at like specifically to staggering contests have any effect on who the eventual nominee is. Have done nothing to look at whether it's an open or closed primary, caucus versus any type of primary. But what we found was it didn't really matter what order states would have gone in. You would have still ended up with Clinton as the nominee for the Democrats and Trump with it as the nominee for the Republicans. That given how the media environment is now, with basically the primary effectively starting for the Democrats in the beginning of 2019, that most of what potential voters would have learned about candidates if they had done well or poorly in, say, Iowa or New Hampshire, this has already been covered in terms of media coverage of candidates in the months leading up to the primary. So basically, once people had made up their minds by what we found in December, January 2015, 2016, they didn't really budge in terms of altering their choice of who they supported based on election outcomes in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, and so on. It's interesting that it's unclear how well that maps onto 2020, for instance, in terms of if there's any sort of learning or vote changing between, say, folks who are trying to decide between Buttigieg and Biden. If they see that Biden comes in fourth, for instance, in Iowa, they might switch to Buttigieg because they want to back a winner. But it's unclear at this point how many people are like that, given the near like 8-10 months of like initial information that people have in terms of deciding who to support already.
Yeah, I mean, the campaign season's gotten so much longer. But I'll go to two things about the system, particularly the Democratic side. So as you may already know, the Democrats went through a lot of iterations of their presidential nominating system, starting in 1968 with a pretty disastrous convention in Chicago. And then by 72, they've adopted a lot of reforms. And they institute quotas for the delegations, male, female, and then Jesse Jackson runs in the 80s, and he runs twice, 84 and 88, and he really does so well in getting people out the door. He wins Michigan in one of those years, 84, 88. won Michigan, and he insisted on better racial and ethnic representation in the delegation. So things have changed a lot on the Democratic side. It's always been contentious and chaotic. The Republicans rarely ever change it. In fact, they haven't really changed it. In 2016, they did, and it wrought Trump. Proportional representation. But I think, to your point, this is a product of the Constitution. The Constitution gives states really the power to regulate the time, manner, and place of elections. And that what has grown into that is that since Andrew Jackson developed a modern political party out of state legislatures and at the state level, there was an incentive for state parties to take hold of this process. So as you reform the process, even in the 20th century, states still control it and they get to pick how it's done. And where you vote, how the ballot's printed. And I could not even follow Iowa's system this year. I couldn't figure out how they were doing things. And I study this for a living, and I thought, how's anybody going to figure this out? Ranked choice voting. California, they've gotten rid of the partisan primary. So it's just two of the biggest vote getters. Good luck in being a Republican trying to win statewide office in California, for the next 50 years. And in the 80s, California was competitive and Republican. These kinds of decisions are made by state political parties who capture state legislatures. And that's the Constitution. And there's no nationalizing it. There's no way to get around that. And that is what yields a lot of this chaos in our nominating system. I think a lot of people would like to go to a national primary one day. Everybody get out the door and vote for your Republican or your Democrat on one day. But that would rip out the sort of heart of the infrastructure of state parties. And there are a lot of people who recognize that infrastructure helps you win county elections, city elections, state elections. If you rip out that infrastructure, then you have nothing to mobilize and organize in every other level of government. So there's a sort of really strong tie between having this control and working in this presidential level and also being strong at the state level. And I think that's why they keep it, even though the rest of us look and say, this is ridiculous. Yes. Yes.
Well, I believe that Iowa and New Hampshire are still first because the parties let them be first. It isn't strictly a state matter. Mm-hmm. And they could dictate that we're going to have a lottery, and next time it could be Rhode Island, hopefully, which maybe would not be good for people here. So I think the order, I still think the sequencing has some impact on things in terms of the issues that come up, at least, and how things happen. And then in terms of your argument about the grassroots level and all that, I mean, Democrats won the presidency with Obama and then lost, thousands of seats all over the country at the local level, which is still resonating. So,
but there's a strain of argument in the Democratic Party that's because the president didn't build the party, that Obama had things to do, like save the economy, and 2 wars to fight, and terrorism to fight, and he was busy. But he did not build the national party structure. And I think that's a bit, that he didn't build the national party structure, and then there were problems in the DNC that nobody was paying attention to that erupted when Hillary ran, but also that state parties complained about this as well. So that's the flip side of your point. The flip side is you need the parties to win elections, organizationally to be strong. And then the other part of you is, well, no, if it doesn't represent, even if the party is strong in Iowa or New Hampshire, it doesn't represent the country in terms of the Democratic Party, so why should they have undue influence by going early?
And he's not helping the party underneath either. So they need the ballot. I mean, they need the ballot line because of the Electoral College, and then that's all they need is the brand. At the presidential level and the local level, I just think has become disengaged from each other in the last several decades, more so than 30 years ago.
Thank you for your question. Yes, sir.
Potential scenario where, as Biden fades, or if Biden continues to fade, and Buttigieg becomes the moderate alternative, and people begin to get worried about his electability, that Senator Klobuchar emerges as the moderate candidate, or is that just unrealistic?
Anyone want to jump in?
I mean, my immediate reaction would be that it would all depend on how Pete Buttigieg handles sort of the darling spotlight that comes along with being a heavy front runner. Can he withstand all of the media scrutiny that is going to come once he emerges to the forefront? if he can, if the media starts digging up all kinds of comments that he made in his past or things that he did that were questionable, or digging deeply into his record in South Bend, Indiana, and the things that could be really detrimental to the way people view him in the national media. If he can withstand that, yes. If he can't, then that typically has been the pattern when it comes to presidential primaries: is can you withstand the media punch? And I don't know if Pete Buttigieg can. I don't know if Amy Klobuchar can. So we'll see. It's a different Democratic Party.
Not, I think, going to find it easy, yeah, even if Biden somehow fades, to secure the nomination, because the Sanders people are really aggressive and have been organizing, and are prepared to fight even harder this time around. I think that any other election year without Trump in the office, Buttigieg would have had a really good shot at securing the nomination, I think. And maybe this is.
Thank you for a great presentation. My question involves the general election. Does the Democratic Party have a plan, or do they even have a clue that they need a plan to reach out to the various voting blocs that stayed home in the 2016 election? Obviously, the Bernie bloc takes most of the blame because they are the most audible in stalking off the stage with their tutu on Cricket. And I get it that people are mad at them, but there's also the African-American vote that really stayed home in the 2016 election, and also all those coal miners in West Virginia and Kentucky and Western Pennsylvania that Hillary said she was going to put out of business. Is there a plan to reach out to them somehow and bring them back in to get them to vote?
That's a great question. I'm going to piggyback on that and ask the panelists to all comment. Would having an African American vice presidential candidate do the trick? In other words, get particularly disaffected African Americans back out the door. Would that be enough, or would that be substandard, given that you held the White House as had African American president for 2 terms? So I wondered if you wanted to talk about that. Anybody want to take that?
I can answer that one really quickly, because that same Washington Post poll, they asked that question explicitly, and it was like less than 20% of African Americans said that having an African American vice president would actually make them more likely to support the Democratic candidate. As far as like what the Democratic Party is doing, they have to figure out what messages will attract those voters. So, yeah, it's like, well, the campaigns themselves have to go out and do research. They have to do focus groups in all these different areas where they need voters to come out. The Michigans, the Pennsylvanias, Floridas, and figure out, well, what specific messages do they have to target toward these voters, to potential voters, to get them out. And I think, it's becoming harder and harder to determine what those specific messages might be. I mean, in one place it might be criminal justice, in another place it might be, marijuana legalization. In another place it might be college debt reform. So it's just a matter of being really, really targeted and specific about what voters in different pockets would even want to come out for. And I don't know if the party knows that quite yet.
I think that the Sanders and Biden campaigns have like a couple different approaches to thinking about how like they would pivot from the primary to the general. Biden's remarks a lot about like trying to, like, if you were elected, work across the aisle and everything. Seems to be an emphasis on kind of like recruiting some of these Obama to Trump voters. But the recent polling data suggests that these Obama to Trump voters really like President Trump. So if the election in 2020 is a referendum on the first 4 years of the Trump administration, then it seems unlikely that this type of outreach will necessarily be effective. Not to say that it's impossible, but it just be a little bit more uphill. And I think Sanders has a slightly different tack in that what I understand to be some of like the goal is that like trying to mobilize people who didn't kind of like show up, and that especially with like youth turnout, the idea of like getting people who didn't vote in 2016 to turn out, relative to Biden's trying to like persuade people who turned out but voted for somebody who's a little bit different. I think there's an acknowledgement that these aren't mutually exclusive strategies. It'll be up to the candidate come June, July to decide where they want to allocate their resources. especially in kind of conjunction with some of the Senate races that are up. It might be helpful in term for this like national level organization to pair with the state level parties to identify, is this a more mobilization type story within a given state, to go to Jonathan's point on kind of like targeting strategies to given areas. Or other states might be we have this set of people who are going to turn out to vote. It's just a matter of trying to persuade the people who are going to turn out to support the Democrats versus the Republicans this time.
Get to you, but Katherine, did you want to comment?
I just think that it's not certain that there will be a high turnout of minority voters in 2020, and that Democrats will have to be very careful. I think that they should again target Trump. Trump's State of the Union speech was quite different than what one had expected. He did quite a lot on sort of reaching out to minority voters with the kind of issues that he campaigned on. I mean, he talked about like school choice, but I think if we talk about gun rights or gun control to prevent mass shootings, the one that killed all of those Latinos, still shouldn't be something that's forgotten or forgiven. So if they focus on issues that will hurt Donald Trump and his bid for re-election, I think this might help energize Democrats. So there's quite a few issues. But if Trump is allowed to just talk about moderate policies, like just school choice, and symbolic issues such as, recognizing people who, are minorities, this, I think, is going to hurt Democrats enormously in terms of turnout.
My question has to do with Bernie Sanders in light of sort of what's happened in Europe with the election of Boris Johnson and elsewhere in Europe. My big question for the Democrats, I don't really care how aggressive Sanders people are, is that do we really can we get back the presidency of the United States, i.e. a Democratic candidate, if we put up somebody as liberal as Warren and Sanders, or are we simply, giving the re-election to Trump, given the fact that there's so many people, now that I've lived through the last 8 years of, the last 4 years of Trump, that there's so many voters across our country who will not vote for somebody like Sanders, given the fact that they think his policies, et cetera, the word socialism, et cetera, is way too extreme for this country, which basically is a left moderate nation.
It's a great question. I'll start really quickly, just based on what our panelists have already said. I think there's two general elite conversations going on about Sanders. One is, and I think Jonathan said this a little bit more, that don't discount his ability to mobilize. That, in fact, if he can get, youth turnout, people between the ages of 18 and 29 has stayed about the same, a little bit of a blip in the first Obama election, somewhere between, 48%, on a good day, 51%. It's not high enough. So if you can get, if youth voter turnout went up 5%, the Democrats would win. So there are latent constituencies the Democrats don't tap effectively enough to get the majorities to win. Can Bernie Sanders actually do that? That would require a second thing, which is that women who supported Hillary Clinton would have to forgive him. Unlike the Bernie supporters who didn't forgive Hillary Clinton, those women who liked Hillary Clinton would have to say, I don't care, I want to beat Donald Trump, I'm going to vote for Bernie. And the third would be, and this is, I think, a bigger challenge, potentially, although maybe the polling data is suggesting some windows, is that African Americans decide that Bernie will be good for them, that the policies he's espousing will be good for them. Those three things could happen. And that would outweigh, possibly, in some areas of the country, swing states, the sort of Republicans who are going to vote Republican, and then the independent suburban voters who won't vote for Sanders because they think he's going to raise their taxes. So it's really about geography and the intersection of mobilizing those particular groups. So there's an argument. He can do it. If he does it, he can win. If he can't do it, he can't win. But that latter statement is true of all the Democratic candidates. If they can't do it, they can't win. So anybody else want to jump in?
I think the partisan dynamic, the deep level of party polarization right now is the thing that lends itself to Bernie being more viable than I think we give him credit. I mean, and traditionally, yes, the American politics, presidential politics, has been about moving to the center and attracting the median voter. But Democrats and Republicans are so polarized, not just at the legislative level, but everyday people who identify as Democrats and Republicans. Like, we live in this affective, polarized environment where Democrats and Republicans literally do not like one another. We don't like our politicians to reach across the aisle and agree with Democrats or Republicans. So, what Democrat speaks better to deep, deep left commitments than Bernie Sanders? That might be his path. Now, what would that mean for the future of party politics? To me, it's kind of a scary thing because now it's just going to be Republicans and Democrats just completely not agreeing on anything and moving farther and farther away, and we'll be just living in basically two countries that I guess swap it up every now and then. But I do think Bernie has a chance given the fact that we are so divided along party lines right now.
Yes, sir.
I just want to ask you guys to talk a little bit about whether we're looking too much at the statistics that we're interested in and not enough about personality and organization. Like one of the things, Wendy, that you mentioned was that, like now we have 25 female senators, right? So if 1 out of every 4 senator is a woman, you might expect 1 out of every 4 presidential candidates like who make it to the national election to be a woman too. So once every 2 cycles or something like that. So I don't think it's that strange that we're not nominating a woman like, Liz Warren is still way in the race, of course, but if you look at who's polling ahead, it looks to me like Bernie's going to win it all because Buttigieg is pretty much right now his only competition, and Buttigieg is untested. Plus the fact that he scares a lot of folks because he comes from Harvard and from the military, and he's not a Democrat in the eyes of a lot of Democrats, especially not the liberal ones. So I would guess that Buttigieg is not gonna rise the way that people think. Bernie's highly organized. People love to listen to him. You can sit for 3 hours and listen to Bernie Sanders, just like Trump fans can sit for 3 hours and listen to Donald Trump. So I think we really ought to be asking ourselves this question, like, are we looking at organization and personality enough in thinking ahead as to what the result's going to be?
Well, I do think that, his organizational skills are important and could, the partisan divide could be a reason why if Sanders won the primary, won the nomination contest, that he could still defeat Trump. But I have to say I'm actually more inclined to think that Sanders would be too polarizing of a figure within the Democratic Party to out enough voters to defeat Donald Trump. So I am thinking that there's too many issues, too much history and issues that Sanders is bringing into the race. Despite his organizational skills, that
Yeah, I think to your point about Bernie, I think you're right about organization. He's run a national campaign essentially, and perhaps he can succeed again. The only other thing you think about when you think about Bernie Sanders is that the macro environment under which this election will take place, and Drew and Jonathan both said the economy really matters, but people have been through, 8 years of, in some ways, sort of a spiritual uplift in the Democratic Party with Obama, but also a lot of insecurity and a lot of nervousness and a lot of financial hardship. And that's a long time to go through that kind of pain. And now we're seeing, as Trump said, and, he can sometimes exaggerate. This is true. However, the numbers of unemployment across the board among a lot of communities have gone down. So people have gone from worrying that they're going to get laid off and lose their house and home to now, except for the retail industry, which is really suffering, generally feeling a little bit better about that. Or if I lose my job, there's another job I can get. They're not all high paying. And that's really something we want to hold on to. So are people willing to live with Trump so that they can have the sort of more calmness and security of a better economy? And that's where Bernie will upend all of it. So Bernie represents upending all of that comfort zone. And to me, that's the policy reason why I think it's problematic for him. I don't dispute the organization or the enthusiasm. And he is really good on the debate stage. I mean, when you watch debates, you watch with different people, they like, oh, he answers the question. He goes right to it. I mean, there's no sort of political speak. He's just so, but on the other hand, the policies themselves will signify a tremendous amount of change. And whereas Trump said he was going to be the candidate of change, he didn't change anything really. He's trying to take us backwards, essentially, in some ways, certainly in terms of race and social policy and women. But in terms of the economy and regulation, he adopted regular Republican Party policies. So it changed from Obama, but it wasn't unfamiliar to Americans. You know, this kind of scope would be unfamiliar to Americans. Medicare for all, free college. So I think that's the other question mark. You know, will it scare people, this kind of potential change, or will it excite them? That's a very good point you're raising.
I wanted to add that Sanders has made an impact already, though, I think, on the Democratic Party and politics in general, so that, he has a legacy.
Nate Silver's 538 blog and think like, okay, there's a place we can look at numbers in a rational fashion. As soon as they update the numbers after the final results from Iowa, Bernie's going to go to a 65% likelihood of capturing the delegate majority. So like that's going to change a lot of people's minds about what you guys are talking about right now. Like, I don't have a horse in the race. I really wanted Liz because I think she's more of a rational person. Bernie's hair is crazy, and I love it.
I don't know about his hair.
College student in upstate New York, and people thought he was an honest and good guy then. And if honest, good guy is against tough, nasty liar, who knows, right? So anyway, I'm sorry.
You want to?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Could you talk about vulnerable senators and the race for the Senate? You mentioned, I think, Professor Schiller, you were talking about perhaps impacts on female candidates, vulnerable senators up for re-election. I mean, I think of Susan Collins, and right now I can't remember if the Democrat who's running against her, or most likely running against her, is a woman or a man. So so that takes away from my point. But still, could you just talk about the Senate and what might change and implications for women politicians?
Sure, I'll just do that really quickly. I'm expanding the universe. There are 6 Senate seats essentially in contention. There are 23, maybe Georgia, but we can have a discussion about that. 23 Republican-held seats that are being contested and 12 Democratic-held seats. There's only one vulnerable Democratic seat. That's Alabama. Doug Jones voted to convict Donald Trump today, which was, you could argue, a pretty brave vote because if Jeff Sessions is the nominee in that primary against him, he'll lose, most likely. But if Roy Moore gets the nomination, then you think Doug Jones might beat him again. So you just don't know. But that was a signal that said, and on the other side, Cory Gardner is most expectations will lose against John Hickenlooper if he's the nominee in Colorado. And so he's sort of acting like he's already lost in a lot of ways. So that's Colorado and that's Alabama. So you've got Kansas, which is really interesting. There's an open seat in Kansas. There's a newly Democratic elected governor woman, Laura Kelly. And now Kobach might be the nominee. And he lost last time statewide. And there's a woman who was a Republican and now a Democrat, Barbara Bollier. She's planning to run, and they're clearing the field for her. So they're thinking they can make a real run at that seat. And in Arizona, it's a crowded primary somewhat, but Mark Kelly is raising a tremendous amount of money. He's the husband of Gabby Giffords, who was shot, as you recall, as a congresswoman. And he's running against Martha McSally. So you have to decide whether an astronaut beats an Air Force pilot. And Amy McGraw, also Air Force and Army, is running against McConnell. And we'll see how she does. It's unlikely she'll beat him. And then you have Tom Tillis is unpopular in North Carolina. And that's where I think African-American voting turnout is absolutely crucial. Certainly there's been fairly significant voter suppression efforts in North Carolina that have been successful. But there's a Democratic governor now with a sort of bare majority Republican legislature. So we'll have to see how that goes. But if there is a good candidate, probably a man, but I'm not positive, I'm not sure how that's going to go, then I think North Carolina gets in play. So you've got a little more of expanded universe for the Senate. It is possible for the Democrats to take the Senate, and I'm not as persuaded that it depends on Donald Trump. I actually think these races are fairly individual, and they are happening in states that are shifting blue to some extent, except for maybe North Carolina, but generally shifting blue. So there's a real chance for pickup. You want to imagine at least one seat, probably two, maybe three. It would take a big. It would, obviously that's where Bernie Sanders comes in. If there's large turnout in Colorado, then you pick up that seat easily. I don't know if Bernie Sanders brings large turnout in Kansas. So that's where we stand with the Senate. So there'll be, like I was thinking, if Susan Collins loses, she loses to a woman, you might get one extra woman in the Senate. But if Martha McSally loses, then you go back to even. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
I just wanted to hear your opinion on what has happened with Elizabeth Warren. If the disaffected Hillary voters had followed her, perhaps why she would have done better. And secondly, do you think she got trapped into being too hard on a Medicare for All decision? Should she have avoided that? But what's your views
I'm going to
on
open that
what
up
happened
to the
to
panel.
Elizabeth Warren?
Anybody want to take that? Drew, you want to take?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that Warren kind of, in launching her candidacy, kind of like got stuck a little bit in that advocating more like her traditional kind of like more progressive policy positions that she advocated in the Senate, got stuck with Sanders being in relatively the same spot preference-wise, which kind of took some support. Some of her supporters are former 2016 Sanders supporters. Didn't draw, from the data I've seen, didn't draw substantially from Clinton supporters. Most of Hillary Clinton's supporters went to Biden or Buttigieg. And then a lot of support for Warren is kind of like drawn from people who are like lukewarm but not entirely invested in the Democratic Party. If you ask them, it's like, is being a Democrat important or not important to you? If people said that like being a Democrat was important to them, they were going to back Biden. So Warren was basically in a bit of a pickle based on like the mix of policies and then other kind of like characteristics about herself that might generate the broader base of support than about the 15% or so that she gets in polling averages. In another context, right, she might get more, might get less. But also, like, thinking it's just like there's a lot of variation within the Democratic Party that most of the candidates are covering, and they're all also overlapping as well. So,
Again, I think people look at her and think of someone who can defeat Donald Trump. So it is surprising that she didn't do as well in Iowa as one would have expected, given her performance on the debate floor and in general. So I don't think it's out for her, though. So we'll see what happens Super Tuesday.
I just think she's just struggled to do a couple of the things that you need to do, particularly as a candidate of color or a female candidate, which is find a way to garner media attention and then start raising money early, get a lot of donor support, heavy donor support early. And I think she struggled to do that, and I don't think it's her fault. I think latent sexism, distrust of women candidates, not seeing women as viable presidential candidates, it caused her to get off to a slower start when it comes to that. I mean, it's just kind of the simple test of ask your friend who doesn't really care much about politics. Ask them what they know about Elizabeth Warren, if they've heard of Elizabeth Warren. You're likely to get an answer. Who's that, right? And that's a function of she just doesn't get the same type of play on CNN and some of the major networks as a Biden, as a Bernie Sanders, and she doesn't have the name recognition from having run for president before. So.
And the last thing on Elizabeth Warren is that, she's a Harvard Law School professor, and we all like the Ivy League at Brown, but and then she's lived in New Jersey, but then she's from Oklahoma. So you kind of got a little dizzy. Where are you actually from? Where did you, as Bernie Sanders, who's from Brooklyn and still sounds like he's from Brooklyn, and I have the same problem with the New York accent, but he's been in Vermont forever. You think of him. But I think her problem was, who is she? Who does she belong to? What does she represent? She's a woman, but who does she represent? And I think in that sense, she and Amy Klobuchar suffer from the same issue. Hillary Clinton was a different case, but, who are your people? And I don't think she ever really resonated in a way that suggested that she had some sort of core group of people that she represented besides being a woman. And I think to get the enthusiasm that Bernie Sanders had, or even Clinton had, or even Cory Booker had for a little while, I think you have to have that. And she didn't have it. She doesn't have it. That's why I think one of her obstacles. Yes. And we'll get to you.
In terms of, we've been talking a lot about Bernie Sanders and turnout, and that's his big sort of appeal. But the Iowa caucus numbers were nowhere near what people sort of predicted, and turnout was on par with 2016, is what they're sort of looking at right now, though we don't have all the numbers. So I'm wondering if the sort of like Bernie movement is given too much credit in many ways for turnout in the most recent election, given what we're looking at and given sort of the circumstances. Could there be, for lack of a better term, burnout around sort of the Bernie revolution, as the turnout numbers aren't what people are expecting?
So that's a fantastic question that I don't think we can answer yet, because we really have to get to Super Tuesday to figure that out. And that's true also of Latino and African American voters in general in this election. You know, if they really love Biden, are they going to get out the door in South Carolina? Are they going to get out the door on Super Tuesday to save this guy because he's plummeting? If he loses New Hampshire in a big way, you know, then you wonder, where is the enthusiasm? And I think that's the biggest fear for the Democrats, is that across the board, either Democrats are so demoralized or they're so persuaded Trump can win, that they just don't get out the door. They just decide this is going to be a mess. And that opens up the door for Michael Bloomberg, who, with that kind of resources and that kind of money, can stay in this race as a Democrat or as an independent or do whatever he wants. And just fascinating to see if the apathy grows in the Democratic Party. You know, will this whole thing unfold, you know, collapse for the Democrats? And then the thing that's floating it up, keeping it up, is actually that House and the Senate races. And that's the big concern I think Pelosi has right now. She doesn't want this Democratic presidential thing to drag her team down. It's a good question.
Yeah, my question was about Bloomberg. I think the audience and the panelists seem to have uniformly discounted him. He got a passing mention once. People talk about Klobuchar and all these other folks. He's 24% on the predicted nomination odds at this moment, which might be a little bit high, but what would the panelists say, you know, one word answer about what his chances would be of being the Democratic nominee?
This is the second to last question, and then we'll close it. You know, I really didn't think Donald Trump, I thought, I said to my friends, he's not releasing his tax returns. He can't be the Republican nominee. I mean, I've been really, really wrong, so I'm just not going there, but I just think I've been saying this forever, and I've been listening to my colleagues, particularly about identity politics, women, African American, Latino voters. I just don't. If you look at the history of Bill Clinton through Barack Obama and everybody in between, when African Americans turn out in bigger numbers and Democrats either maintain a modicum of white voters or lose white voters, they win. But if African Americans do not turn out in real numbers, they lose. So I don't know how Michael Bloomberg wins without really enthusiastic African American turnout, and I just don't know if he can produce that given his legacy in New York on some really controversial policies. That's the big question mark. If he can get some share of the African American vote during the primaries, then we have a different ballgame on our hands. Then it's not as obvious that he can't win. You know, I don't know.
I think that the women's vote is going to be critical in this election, and I, think Bloomberg does have a shot at the black vote. Mayors are sort of, there's a soft spot in the hearts of black voters for mayors, and so Bloomberg, despite stop and frisk, probably could pick up support of blacks. But will he pick up support of women? And I think, I'm waiting for this election to become a referendum on the women's vote. That is going to be critical. Warren has a good shot at, I think, recovering, and Buttigieg is excellent and could make a case for why he deserves a nomination. And Sanders is on issues, and so I think he did respond pretty well to Elizabeth Warren's statement that he thinks women can't win the presidency, and so he has still opportunity to secure the women's vote. But I think women are going to be really important in this primary election.
I think Bloomberg has a puncher's chance. I mean, seriously. I mean, Look at the fact that he can spend crazy amounts of money on ads during primary season. You look at the fact that he's still polling for some reason, even though people haven't even seen his ads nationally. He has name recognition. I mean, he has all the things that a candidate would need to be viable at this point. And that was my last point. Oh, the economy thing. So Professor Schiller mentions this earlier, how the sort of main thing going for Trump is these economic indicators, right? It's like it's really tough to unseat an incumbent when unemployment is low, GDP growth is up, household income is up, all these signs that the economy is vibrant. How do you actually sell the message if you're from the opposing party that we need to get this person out of office? Well, if anybody can convince people that they should trust them with the economy relative to a guy who seems to be doing well with the economy, it would be this really, really rich guy, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. That's right.
so puncher's chance. I thought Bloomberg was going to run in 16, and I thought he would have won if he had run in 16.
Just to cap on that, even despite spending all of that money, I don't think that Bloomberg is relatively few people's top choice or even second choice. If you have, so it's an interesting thing. It was Steyer, Bloomberg dumping a lot of money into advertising. Was impressed to see campaign ads by moving up to Rhode Island. I was in Tennessee for the last 6 years, seeing campaign ads and here, but not really understanding the media market. That makes more sense now with Steyer. But even all that, Bloomberg, despite all this money, doesn't seem to have a lot of people actively considering him. It still seems to be a Warren, Buttigieg, Biden, Sanders, potentially Klobuchar type thing.
No, Rhode Island would like a word with you.
Well, two really quick things. One is if Biden really falters, then I think Bloomberg totally absorbs a lot of the Biden supporters and becomes viable overnight, more viable, as Catherine suggests and Jonathan suggests. He's already viable. And the second thing is Gina Raimondo is you may like or not like her as a Rhode Islander. She's our governor. She's been reelected, and she endorsed him today. And she just has finished a term being the chair of the Democratic Governors Association. So she must be talking to governors around the country that are Democrats, and they must be sort of talking about where they think this will go and where their voters who voted for them to put them in Wisconsin and North Carolina and Nevada and Michigan, who will those voters vote for? And they must believe that they think Bloomberg might be able to win some of those voters. So she's not going to do this in a vacuum, and she did it today. That's true, but she's shrewd, Gina Raimondo. So it's a signal because of her prior experience and connection with Democrat governors across the country that there must be some sort of let's line up behind Bloomberg in case maybe Sanders surges. It's an interesting thing. Well, nope, I don't. I'm with Catherine on this. We got to go to Super Tuesday. Yes, sir.
A quick question. Given that beating Trump is the most important issue, you said, and given that
For the Democratic Party.
for the Democratic Party, and given that all the Democratic candidates seem to have flaws or weaknesses that people are afraid of, is this the year that finally who's vice president makes a big difference as a team member?
So the question is, does the vice president make a difference? I'll jump in first, and then you can disagree with me. You agree with me. I think Professor Tate's point about women and about the importance of women in the primary process, but also in the general election. I think those numbers are pretty high against the president. So if that seems to really emerge in a bigger way, and I have no doubts that the president will do more things that are controversial in the next couple months. He's not going to go away from his own strategy. I see him possibly dumping Pence because he's going to win Indiana anyway, and picking Nikki Haley as his vice presidential running mate. He's got a couple months to decide. I think that's a formidable ticket. I think Nikki Haley will attract a lot of support among women, and I think possibly even cross some partisan lines among women. And I think that could be, as Sarah Palin was a negative drain on McCain's ticket, I think that Nikki Haley could be a balancing effect among some women for Donald Trump. And if he sees polling that doesn't look good, I would not doubt it for a minute. He'd do it in a heartbeat. If somebody said, you'll win with this woman, why don't you pick her? And that would change things considerably if they won. You'd have a sitting female vice president who was quite viable to be the next nominee. That's a big deal. That would shift things quite a bit. So who wants to disagree with me or agree with me?
No, I think it's diabolical, and, I feel sorry for Mike Pence that, he works for someone like that.
It's true. There's no reward for that loyalty.
But I think that he should be concerned about the women's vote, and I think that, yes, a vice presidential mate, female, in Trump's case would help. I think for the Democrats, though, they can't be the front runner without already addressing the women's vote. So I'm not sure, pick a female or even a minority for the vice president to run with will turn things around in a dramatic way for the Democratic nominee.
Might have something on like an edge case where if people are if it's like Sanders or Biden at the top of the ticket, maybe ensuring that the VP is somebody who's younger, to provide that like counter argument to people saying that like, well, I'm like reluctant to turn out to support somebody who is in their late 70s to like support like for the candidate. So like thinking about maybe being a little bit more strategic, that might matter, but that's not I don't think that'll be like shaping thousands of votes necessarily. It could be something helpful to assuage any concerns that people have with the ticket, but I don't know if it'll.
He doesn't think it matters.
Yeah.
Professor Collins, last word?
I would be terrified if he did that, because that is a really, really smart plan. So we'll see. I mean, usually the VP doesn't matter except for the home state, of the VP's home state. But I could see a scenario where Trump actually secures, especially folks who are still high on the sexism scale, but maybe even thinking about leaning Democrat. And that's what you're seeing in the primary. Are some of these white male candidates are doing well because their success is correlated with folks being high on latent sexism. Well, adding somebody like Nikki Haley could help swing some of those voters who are slightly sort of left-leaning, but maybe not sold on someone like Bernie Sanders, who might be too far left. And then here's something that makes Trump more attractive to those folks who have those concerns. I could see it working. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did. I don't know.
Yeah. Yep. So we will have to wait and see. We'll come back and do another forum in the fall. Wait, one
Wendy,
super. We gotta go. But one last question.
From your research, do you all believe that his coalition or support base has expanded or contracted in ways that were different than his coalition in 2016? Or do you feel like his ideological basis has evolved in any significant or even subtle way from his 2016 basis?
So I'll just repeat the question. Has Bernie Sanders expanded his electoral coalition from 2016, or just changed the components of that coalition, that who's in it and who's out, and does that make a difference moving forward? I don't know the answer to that, so I can't even speculate on it.
Fortunately for that question, there are some nice public opinion data that actually have interviewed people in 2016, asking them about who they support in the primary, and then we have recent re-interviews of the same individuals, so we can track who they're supporting over time. It seems that a lot of what Sanders supporters now, like where they're coming from, it's like a core set of 2016 Sanders supporters. Without comparing kind of like demographic or like issue position breakdowns in 2020 relative to 2016, it seems that it's potentially more concentrated, where you had folks who supported Sanders in 2016, the biggest defection area for them was going to Warren, at least within these data. So it seems that there's more of a bit like potentially more of a ceiling to Sanders' potential success, but that's also conditioned on all the candidates that are currently in the race staying in the race. So if Warren were to say drop out, then you would have potentially a lot of those former 2016 Sanders supporters like return home. So.
All right, thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it. And as I said, we'll be back in September to talk more about this.